Good evening. My name is Vishwanathan, and I am a member of the faculty at the Observer Research Foundation. I have great pleasure in welcoming all of you on behalf of ORF to this very important discussion today. And usually we have it in the daytime, but today we are having it in the evening. It's a bit more relaxed, I think. And the importance of today's subjects cannot be overstated. In fact, all of us are talking about pollution, and it's a very timely publication that you have brought out. I have had the pleasure of going through the book, not in full detail, but it seems to be very interesting, and it's sure to generate a debate and a discourse in the country, probably leading to some practical solutions. In fact, I had half a mind to make this whole thing dramatic by having all of us discuss this with masks on. Why I am saying this? Because you might recall that about 4 years ago, when the Paris climate talks were about to take place, the Maldivian president, in order to stress the point of the problem of island nations and the sea level rising, he had a cabinet meeting, well publicized, underwater. And all his cabinet ministers were wearing scuba diving equipment. So that was on a lighter note, but I think all of you will agree that this is a very, very important topic for all of us, not only in the national capital region, but as the book says, the entire North India. The book clearly brings out what air pollution means to the ordinary citizen and the enormous havoc that it's causing to everyday lives. He quotes a figure that more than 1 million people in India die every year just because of air pollution. The causes are well known. Papers have been writing: crop burning, construction, polluting industries, coal-fired thermal power plants, diesel generators, etc., etc. But the basic question is, what do we do about it? Every winter we talk about it, but is enough being done? And to explain all this, of course, we have the author himself, Mr. Siddharth Singh, who will be introduced formally by our moderator. And without much ado, I think I'll hand over the proceedings to Ms. Bahar Dutt, who will be moderating. First, she'll introduce a speaker. You can introduce the book, and there can be a Q&A session. So a special welcome to Mr. Siddharth Singh and to Ms. Bahar Dutt. And very soon we will be joined by the Honorable Member of Parliament, Dr. Shashi Tharoor, who will be giving the keynote address later. Ms. Bahar Dutt is an award-winning environment journalist and conservation biologist. She has worked with CNN News 18 as their environment editor and is currently working on a book for the Oxford University Press. The proceedings are in your safe hands.
All right, excellent. This is working, I think. So first of all, my apologies for coming late. I was caught in one of the reasons which causes air pollution in the city, which is traffic jams, and I apologize for that. Siddharth, you're an energy mobility and climate policy expert, as the blurb on your book says. You've been selected to be a German Chancellor Fellow in 2016. You worked under the guardianship of Chancellor Angela Merkel, so it would be interesting to know how that experience was. Well, you've written this fantastic book, which I've been leafing through over the past few days. Just to give a brief introduction, I know the newspapers are full of air pollution stories these days, but just to put it in a perspective, human beings can live about 5 weeks without food, 5 days without water, but not more than 5 minutes without air. And yet there seems to be an odd kind of inertia when it comes to dealing with the air apocalypse that's taken over Delhi. And sometimes we forget 100 cities across India. I know that the conversation typically focuses around Delhi, but if you look at the data right now and you look at the WHO reports, cities across India are suffering at the moment. So, Siddharth, you say you're an energy, mobility, and climate expert. I liked your book itself, the honesty comes across, because you say you're not that, typical tree hugging environmentalist, and you quite honestly admit you're not a researcher of PM 2.5, you're not a physicist or a doctor. Yet, you wrote this exhaustive book on air pollution. You say you were just plain curious. So, why does someone who is just curious go and
So thank you, Bahar. Thanks so much, and more importantly, thanks to the ORF for organizing this wonderful evening. This week is pretty bad when it comes to air quality levels, as you may have seen early in the mornings. So I guess it's appropriate in a way that we are having it in this week rather than any other. Thanks to Ambassador Vishwanathan for his welcome to all of us. And most importantly, a big thank you to Aparajit for organizing this great event. And I've had a couple of very busy days, a couple of very busy weeks. So really had no time to even process what's happening. But he single-handedly put all of this together. So thanks, a big thanks to him. So I'd start with to get into the question. I'd actually want to start with this project that I was working on approximately, I think, 4 or 5 years ago. So I had just joined an organization, and there was this project that had been going on for 2.5, 3 years. It was a massive survey that was done across the country, and we had a lot of very good quality data that had come out. A lot of econometric analysis had taken place. We had just the sheer quantum of new information that was generated was immense. So now we had this great quality of research. It took like around 30 or so people who actually contributed to it. At the end of all of this, uh, I can assure you that less fewer than 30 people ended up actually reading the report, right? So in this costed crores of rupees. There was a into this, like I said, 3 years. So my point was that what's the point of researching if you cannot reach out to people? This includes policymakers, it includes people at large. And often we assume that policymakers are experts, but often they're not. So you have to present information in a language that's accessible to people. It's especially more important in today's day when you have anti-science politicians rising to power across the globe, and especially people who are skeptical of climate change and the vast body of science that kind of points towards that. So in a way, I was kind of inspired to write more in an accessible manner so that people can actually read about this subject. This the case of air pollution becomes even more curious because unlike, say, if you wanted to study fossilized remains 100,000 years ago, you would probably study paleontology and you'd become an expert in the subject and you'll start working on that. If you want to study air pollution, there's no one profession or one stream of science that kind of helps you study that, right? You can look at air pollution from various perspectives. You can be an economist who deals with the externalities and the costs of air pollution to the economy. You can be a doctor or an epidemiologist who studies the impact of air pollution on human health. You can be a chemist who studies the combustion and the generation of particulate matter, and so on and so forth. Meteorologist who studies the impact of weather, and lawyer studies legislation and so on. So I had questions myself. I had questions such as, if a million people are dying due to air pollution. This is what I read in the newspapers back then. I did not know the methodologies that how we actually get to that number. I've described it in the book, but at that time I had no idea. So I wanted to know, if there are a million people dying every year, then where the hell are these people? Where are they dying? Like, we don't get to hear about them. There's no death certificate that says there's somebody who's died due to air pollution. So that was a question. I had several other questions like that. Like, if Europe has a larger industrial base, if Europe has more cars than India does, then why is it that India has worse air quality? So these are questions that I had, and I had a lot of people who would ask me questions because I was working in the field of energy, such as, why can't we have 100% solar? Why can't we stop our coal-fired power plants? To answer those questions, I thought that somebody should be writing a book about it, because I tried looking up on Google, on Amazon, and I couldn't find any book on the issue. It took me a few months to realize that somebody is going to be me, because I had some experience in the subject. So yeah.
So I'm actually going to read out a small paragraph, which is actually the opening of your book, The Silence of a Crisis. It was a bustling Saturday evening in the early winter days of 2005 in Delhi. The market in Paharganj was buzzing with excitement, bathed in the smells of street food and the noise of hawkers and passing traffic. Diwali festivities, after all, were just round the corner. That's when the first bomb exploded. I find it, this analogy you've drawn between an act of terror and air pollution, disturbing and yet so true. You start your book by describing it an act of terror, a bomb blast in the city. You describe how we used to very high levels of security. You go to a mall, you're very, almost mechanically now you open your car and you're ready to be frisked. So we've accepted terror as part of our lives. We've accepted the fact, yeah, sadly, so we have, we've accepted the fact that, we have a government who set up the NIA, we've accepted that there are institutions that respond to terror. Yet, we've not been able to respond to air pollution in the same way. More residents of Delhi, as you just said, are killed silently every week than have been killed in terrorist incidents in the past decade. And yet, policy responses have been silent. So, my question to you at this point is, have there been no policy responses? What did you discover while writing this book?
So, when I talk about when I brought in terrorism, I started this way because I think it's a stark contrast for a very different type of a crisis. So air pollution is also killing, but it's killing in a very different way. And I wanted to understand, or rather explain, why is it that we take it less seriously than it is as an issue. In the case of air pollution, unlike terrorism, there is nobody else to blame on. There's no other. You can, in terrorism, it's easy to find an enemy and kind of talk about it. There's no other. Secondly, the violence in air pollution is not spectacular. It's divided, it's fragmented, it happens across the country. 75% of people, of this 1 million people who die due to air pollution, they die in rural India, right? So we are, we don't even get to hear about these cases. So and thirdly, I think it's also not easy to politicize, unlike terrorism is. We just had the 10th anniversary of 26/11, and even 10 years later we are still talking about it. We have, even ORF came out with some great reports. I went through a couple of them on issues related to terrorism and the responses to 26/11 and so on. So clearly there is a lot of noise around terrorism, whereas air pollution is an extremely silent crisis. And not only is it silent because the impact on the human body is silent, and the impact on the economy is also silent in a way. It's very distributed across the various sectors of the economy, but also the responses to it have been silent. So there is no overarching framework under which these policies operate. There is no a national counter-terrorism initiative that kind of deal with terrorism. There's no such thing happening in the case of air pollution. So I'll give you a small example. Like in most rooms, like such as this one, you're using LED bulbs, right?
Yeah.
Back in the day, it used to be incandescent, and just 10 years or so ago, the situation, the lighting economy in the country was very different. So because of the policy responses of the government, they have been able to introduce LEDs almost everywhere. Even rural India, you have penetration of LED, which does not even exist in countries like Norway and others. So India actually ends up saving 15,000 crore rupees per year only because we have shifted to this. And but this also means that thousands of tons of emissions, carbon dioxide emissions, have been reduced due to this initiative. But nobody would ever cite this as an example of our fight against. In that sense, silence characterizes the issue, which is what I wanted to. And yes, to respond to your question more directly, there are a lot of things that have been done,
Yeah.
except that all these responses have not been a part of any larger framework of fighting against air pollution, which is why we don't know about it. And secondly, the pace of change of the economy has far exceeded.
will make the choices. I'm going to come to a chapter which I had a bit of nitpicking to do with you, which is the one on agriculture. Now, you speak about the happy seeder machines. You even end that chapter by saying that perhaps, technological advancements could address this issue. My worry is, and having traveled across Punjab, having spoken to farmers, the problem is that you've kind of locked the farmer of Punjab into this cycle of paddy and wheat. And there's very little time actually left between harvesting the previous crop and preparing your field for the next, which is why farmers go out and burn their crops. So you've actually locked them into, not you have, but our market is such that they've locked them into this cycle. And the happy seeder, you acknowledge that in the book as well, that is not financially viable, especially if a farmer has a small land holding. So, how can technology address this issue? Do we not have to address larger issues like the state of agriculture in Punjab, whether it should be the need to move to less chemical driven agriculture, whether it's
Yeah.
the issue of the MSP?
Yeah.
So, there are other issues which will, in fact, address the problem of air pollution.
No, absolutely. You're absolutely correct. My focus has been on technology for one important reason. It's because the crisis, in a way, also originated due to technology in the first place.
You're right.
The green revolution, when in fact, this was a question. This is the reason I started writing the book. Was one of my first questions that came to my mind was uh, all this crop burning that's going on. Surely it's not new. It must be going on for the past thousands of years. So why is it suddenly become an issue in 2018 or 17 or 16? So while trying to answer that question, I realized that in fact it's not really an age-old practice.
No. Yeah.
The scale and the timing of it is very. It's constructed by humans, by our policies, by our choices that we have made over the last few decades. So it is not something that even goes back to the time of the independence. So the green revolution was in a way a technology revolution, especially in these parts of the country. Sometimes it's been the green revolution is also referred to as a tube well revolution, simply because they were able to get so many tube wells which have sucked the ground dry now. So this is one of the reasons why I guess the larger agricultural crisis is also dealing with issues of soil quality, of availability of water, and so on and so forth. Uh, the reason I wanted to focus on this is because this is what the government has been focusing on.
Yeah.
The reason I talk about this is to explain the difficulties in actually addressing this problem using these happy seeder machines or these super SMS machines, because India does not even have the manufacturing capacity to make enough of these to actually work on the farms and take care of the crisis. So we need to do other things that incentivize other crops apart from the rice wheat cropping system. So if the pulses or
Yeah.
other, like, I'm not an agricultural expert, but the point is greater crop diversification,
Yeah.
more sustainable farming practices. This is what will eventually change the nature of farming, because it's no matter how much you subsidize these machines, at the end of the day it'll always be cheaper for the farmer to buy a matchstick box worth 2 rupees
Yes,
and
you
burn
say
it.
that in the book.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So let's come to, I mean, we're always every day in the papers we're reading about air pollution. I think there's also a fatigue which sets in because it demotivates us. It's something we've been saying in the climate debate as well, that we need positive example, we need more examples of what works. So I mean, that's what I like about this book. In the end, you come to the solutions, you offer the solutions, you discuss them. So it would be interesting now to focus a little bit, how to think about air pollution. As you rightly say, you talk about issues of equity. There are a number of, you talk about air
If I
pollution is an
can,
unfreedom.
yeah. In
So
fact, I can. I want to talk about the inequality bit a little bit more.
please.
So, we have various kinds of inequality issues in our society today. The most obvious one is income inequality, where there are just vast differences in the levels of incomes between the top 5 or 10 percentile and the bottom, and it's growing. And the problem isn't that in itself. Like, uh, in theory, there's nothing wrong if two people have different levels of income, as long as they can afford similar things. The point is, a few of the spaces in our society that where we should be equal. We are human beings. We should be able to access education regardless of our wealth. We should be able to access healthcare regardless of our wealth.
Yeah.
We should be able to access the fire services or the police regardless of our wealth. It becomes a problem when inequality hinders these kind of basic things that what makes us human and what makes our societies work. So it is here where in today's era, I think air pollution is turning out to be the major inequality issue. It's one of the things that makes a difference between how you experience not just today but how your future will be. I'll give you a small example. There was a study that was done in Colombia where at the end of the day we are all human beings regardless of whether it's Delhi or this thing. Our bodies are the same, particulate matter is the same. They studied little children. uh, One group was where they which was exposed to high air pollution, and the another group which was exposed to cleaner air. And they realized over time that children who were born in places with high air pollution had lower cognitive abilities, like it was impacting their ability to do mathematical problems,
Yeah.
be able to solve science puzzles. And this had an impact not just then but even 15 years later when they grew up and started working. They were earning much less than the children who had grown up in clean air regions. So it's an inequality issue that it's impacting you not just today but also in the
It's
future,
actually
and
perpetuating
it is
inequality.
perpetuating
Yeah.
the problem. Yeah.
Okay, so I'm going to do now a small exercise, which is that imagine in this room you have Arvind Kejriwal, you have the Punjab Chief Minister, and you have Dr. Harshvardhan. Imagine they're on this table. And what would you say to them? The three top decisions they need to take to tackle the great smog of India.
Yeah. So first and foremost, I will wonder why the most important person in the country is also not in the room, because
Okay.
uh,
Maybe he's traveling. I don't
perhaps.
know.
But the reason why China has been able to successfully
Yes.
solve the problem is because their top two most important people, the premier president, they've been consistently over the years making statements against it, about their air pollution crisis. And it's not just loose statements that are like, oh, this is a problem and we should do something about it. You have direct threats coming out from them. There are speeches where the premier has been quoted as saying that if you as an administrator are not able to reduce air pollution levels or particulate matter levels in your particular agency or district or so on, you will be fired. So these are the kind of direct threats that perhaps will work. China and India are very different in their political systems, and I appreciate that. I think it's very important for us to cherish our democracy,
Yeah.
our institutions, and the independence of these institutions. We are not a China, and that is a given. But I still think that until you have the leaders of these important and fairly independent institutions, until they can come together with measurable goals every few months, able to track progress, it's not going to work out. What happens is every winter season, when air pollution levels kind of start shooting through the roof, you have media reports of one chief minister saying something and the other chief minister responding to
Yeah.
it, and it
Yeah.
becomes a media spectacle. What we need is a platform that can get all of them together at least once every few months, because normally I'm not a big fan of creating more institutions, right?
Yeah.
We already have enough institutions, but in this particular case, all these independent institutions need to work together.
Yeah.
You talk about what are the top three things I can tell them. It's a very common question I'm asked, like, what's a low hanging fruit? Can you, Siddharth, can you tell me one thing that will solve the problem?
Yeah.
I wish there was one thing. It would be so easy to then get politicians to act on that one thing. The problem is the issue is so fragmented, so divided across industries, even within industries. So if you're looking at, say, the manufacturing sector, even the manufacturing sector, the problem is so divided. On the one hand, you have the use of energy, so they'll be using, say, coal to heat up the iron ore or whatever, right? So that is one. Secondly, there's fugitive dust and emissions that take place due to the wear and tear of things on these construction sites. Then they're basically these creating of dust bowls in these particular manufacturing centers. So there's so many different aspects even within a sector that there are no two or three low hanging fruits. What we need to do is a coordinated effort across the various sectors, which brings everything under one umbrella. Right now in China, everything, like every industrial decision made, every highway constructed, every residential neighborhood constructed, they all fall under their larger blue skies program, the blue
Yeah.
skies policy.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, in India, there is no such overarching umbrella policy, which is
So
why,
yeah,
yeah,
so sorry to
yeah,
interrupt you,
of
but in
course.
fact, 2 days ago they have introduced the National Clean Air Action Program. The problem is they've not made it legally enforceable. Whereas in China, they set the targets and they said that if you don't meet these targets, then you go, to the bottom of the list or whatever. So do you
Yeah.
think that is the problem? Because
So
we've
in
introduced
the
this
in
now.
the case of the National Clean Air Action Plan, the one key issue, which is something that even other institutions which are a part of the consultation project, aspect of this policy, they also flagged the issue that the program focuses a lot on measuring. Now, measuring is a problem. We need to understand where it's coming from, what exactly is happening.
Yeah.
But I think the focus cannot be on measuring right now. The focus should be on action.
Yeah.
The focus especially should be on the coordination of these various agencies under a umbrella framework. That this policy does not do that. At least does not do that effectively. Which is why something like a Swachh Bharat program. Right now we talk about sanitation related issues. This is primarily a sanitation program. I think the umbrella of this Swachh Bharat definition should expand to beyond that. It should also include clean air, clean water, right? Because these things are very interrelated if you think about it.
Yeah.
And once you have such a Swachh Bharat umbrella policy, which is under such a policy, you can perhaps get these various different sectors to work together towards a unified cause.
Okay, so expanding the concept of Swachh Bharat to the problem of air pollution. I think that's the right note to end this discussion on for now. But we'd love to take some comments, questions from the audience at this point. Yes, if we could get 1 second, we'll just get a mic to you. If you could please introduce yourself and then ask your question.
Hello, my name is Rajiv Saxena. I retired from Government of India from a senior position. I'm an author also, and writing on security issues, and which is my passion on cybersecurity. I have a question for you. If you have read in a few weeks back, the 15th October was the last day of data localization. I strongly believe with the advent of mobile phones and the WhatsApp and the Facebook and the Instagram, the smog in different parts of the country has really risen. When India says good morning on WhatsApp, the WhatsApp breakdown. You have 1.19 billion mobile phones and the charging. You need energy for that. Would you like to comment on that? Because if we take a upwas of a single day, I think you will be saving hundreds and hundreds of megawatt of energy every year.
So
It's a thought-provoking question. So
absolutely,
we keep
absolutely.
our mobile phones
Yeah.
switched off for at least once a day in a week.
So
So extending Earth hour to our mobile phones,
exactly, exactly.
will that work?
Yeah. So my understanding of the issue is that in general, anything that requires people to take such measures becomes very difficult to enforce across the board. I'm personally a fan of policy-driven solutions because I think just a simple example, like going back to the LED example, if we were just prodding people to buy LED bulbs, they would not be doing that. There's no moral case to be made here. Maybe a few people will agree, most people won't, right? So it's a good idea, but can you really get a billion people to turn it off? I think those kind of solutions are harder to even enforce in any way. The reason why the LED program succeeded is because LEDs were very expensive back in the day. We created a new institution called ESL,
Yeah.
which purchased these LED bulbs in mass quantities, and the prices of these bulbs fell. They fell significantly. Now it's become affordable to most people.
And also the fact that the government made these mass procurements, I think that helped immensely as
Exactly,
well.
exactly. So, which is why in even the case of say energy consumption, electronics do the use of electronics is a constituent to our energy demand. But I think a bigger source of energy demand is cooling now, which is something that several agencies have now started focusing their efforts on. India currently has, I think, fewer than 5% of households have air conditioners at
Conditioners,
home.
yeah.
In China, it's around 60%. we will at some point reach
But this
those
is going to
levels.
grow, yeah.
It's going to grow.
Yeah,
It's from
yeah.
5%, it's easily going to be 50, 60% at some point of time. Can you imagine the new amount of energy that will be required to fuel this? And if this energy comes from coal, that's going to be a big problem.
Yes, please. Go ahead.
Thank you very much. My name is Yashvardhan Singh, and I'm a student of law and geology earlier. I want to make a small comment with reference to your point about clearing of fields and the way that farmers are getting really less time between the harvest of the Rabi crop and the sowing of the Kharif crops. There was an act of the Punjab legislature, the Prevention of Subsoil Water Act, which did not allow the farmers in Punjab to sow paddy before a particular date. Because Rabi is essentially a crop which is of the monsoon season, right, running across summer. But because the monsoon, through the southwest monsoon, reaches up till July end in Punjab,
Yes.
the fact is that they delayed the sowing season
Yeah.
so that it could be a rain based crop. But the problem it met with was that because it has a 4 months time, when it had to be harvested, the Kharif season was just coming. So the
Yeah.
farmers cleared the field massively
Yes.
using matchstick, etc.
Yeah.
So my point is that this legislation failed to address the fact that there would be harsh consequences. And right after 2009, when this legislation was enacted, 2, 3 years down the line, we could see from 2012 onwards the effect of smog being more pronounced in Delhi. So my point is that how are the impacts of legislation today studied in India, and what are the consequences therewith? And the second bit, do we have a discourse in India about agroclimatic regionalization? That a semi-arid state like Punjab grows a water intensive crop like rice, and of course depletion of groundwater is but natural. And how is that discourse moving around? Thank you.
Yeah, so that's a great question, and he does partially address this in the book. But I think your first question about, I mean, we have the laws in place. We have some of the best environment laws. We've got a National Green Tribunal. How much does this actually translate into action on the ground?
I think the intentions in India generally are not that bad. Like, we are not bad when it comes to thinking about how we should govern ourselves, be it environment laws or other forms of legislation governing our society. Problem always comes down to enforcement of it. Without specifically answering that question, because you clearly seem to a lot about the issue. I think you made a very good point, and I personally don't know to what extent is that Punjab Subsoil Act, like, can it be replaced? If replaced, by what? Is it even needed? I have not done that kind of a analysis, right? But I've in my book I have cited other lawyers who have actually written about this extensively. So in subjects which I'm not an expert of, I always rely on any peer-reviewed material on the same. So I'm not able to comment on what it can be replaced with. But in general, even in something as simple as the Air Act, or anything like, so the regulation that CPCB has, they don't have enough auditors who can go down to these industries to to measure the emissions, to be able to accurately report. And then even if they do, even if they find them to be violating these certain laws, it's so hard to actually enforce it. Shutting down an industry in any particular district means thousands of lost jobs, economic opportunities. Nobody would want that to happen. The sheer force of the cronyism in this thing, this can beat any legislation, any good intentions that you or your laws
Not
may
just
have.
cronyism. What you find is that the Pollution Control Board doesn't have enough officers in place. So you will have, if you have the DPCC, they will have 2 officers. How are they supposed to, prosecute the violators? I was in fact speaking to a lawyer who told me that under the Air Act, I mean, I till 5 years ago didn't even know we had an Air Act, So, and I don't blame myself for it. Actually, this lawyer told me, he said, not one person so far has been prosecuted under the Air Act. Not one person, as it's been around for 30 years. So, so clearly there is a problem as far as implementation is concerned as well. But I think, I mean, I want to move this into a more positive, in a more positive direction. We've had several directives from the National Green Tribunal. We've had the Delhi Traffic Police, which has now been told you have to charge the violators. So I think the drive has gone. Would you say that there is more action on the ground in the last 2 years at least?
Yeah, I do think so. I do think that more people are talking about it right now. One of the key things that I've demanded in the book almost is that we should politicize the issue a little bit more. Like, people think of politics as necessarily a negative thing, but I think you won't really be able to solve it until you have politicians who can go and make it an election issue.
Yeah.
In a way, it's great that Dr. Shashi Tharoor finds himself interested in the issue, and he's been doing a lot of things in the last few months. Raising the issue. I think he held a seminar at a
Yes.
couple of months
Yeah.
ago. So clearly, there's a lot happening on the front, and this is what we need. We need it to find its way into a manifesto, and we need the other party to promise something even more. And even if the promises are wild at this moment, it doesn't matter. We need those kind of irrational, action or at
Okay.
least promises.
Some more questions? Yes, there's a question at the back.
Hi, my name's Tanisha, and I currently work for a member of parliament. So, when you drew the analogy about Swachh Bharat mission, I mean, getting clean air under Swachh Bharat mission, I couldn't help but think that even when we spoke about Swachh Bharat mission, the problem after a point was we even after we had toilets, it was after all it was a behavioral issue, right? The incentive structure didn't exist even for a lot of people, and something as air pollution, we've been talking about it for a long time, even in the political circles, but what is the incentive structure that we can actually give different stakeholders, be it industries, be it people on the road? Because whenever something's implemented, something as small, as the odd even policy, there's backlash. So is there an incentive structure? Yeah, I can understand clean air and environmental, but is there a tangible incentive that could be looked into? And just your comments on that. Thank
What
you.
are the benefits
Yeah,
to incentivize action around air pollution, apart from good
yeah.
health?
So with Swachh Bharat, it's an obvious issue, right? Like you have created these, you have put in some money. The problem in India is because of the very nature of the government, at least at the central government level, uh, what they can do is put in a policy and put in money towards that particular scheme, right? uh, it's harder to actually implement it and make sure that that particular thing is being used, because the government does not even have the capacity to go down there and see what's happening. It's for other research institutions which or the media which later on goes and finds that it's not being used and so on. uh, with something like like sanitation in general, it's such a intrinsic human thing. If you're used to doing something for 40 or 50 years, it's very hard to suddenly change it, even if you had the infrastructure available to change that. With air pollution also, it is pretty much that. A very small example is, you'll find it's very common for municipal level workers to collect leaves in the neighborhood and just light it to fire, because it's easier than taking it to whatever garbage dump may exist in the other neighborhood. So how do you change that? Even if you did have, like, the government should ideally be putting a lot of money into garbage collection systems and making the system a little more seamless, but even after that, it'll be very difficult to change the behavior. But I think it's a slow process. You cannot expect that something like this will change in just one generation. I think even with say sanitation, perhaps people are not using it today, even if the toilets exist in the homes. But my hope is that the next generation will be using it, and it's a slow process, but it works. At the very least, we need to create the infrastructure for that to happen in the first place, which even in the case of air pollution, we need to have those greater capacity of these state level or these bodies to kind of enforce the rules in the first place, and then hope that over time corruption weeds itself out, or there's the other institutions which deal with corruption are able to better deal with that at some other stage. So yeah.
Yeah. Can we have a mic here, please?
I am a journalist with the CNN News 18, and I specialize in automobiles. Now, my query is that Delhi pollution, if we talk specifically about Delhi pollution, crop burning is for like 2-3 months in the winter season. There are no manufacturing industry here. So, the majority of the pollution here is due to the vehicles, right? and we know
Actually, not majority, but yes, a
a huge amount
a
of pollution
huge
is due to the
amount. But it also
25,
differs
yeah.
from season to season, and there'll
Yes,
be
obviously, but
meteorological
12
factors.
months, if we talk about vehicle pollution, is like contributing the most. Now, there's no electric vehicle policy by the government right now. There's no framework, and I don't think electric vehicles will help eventually because they need the energy.
Actually, you do address that in the book. Okay,
Yeah,
sorry. Yeah,
sorry, I
yeah.
haven't. So they don't. They need the energy at the end of the day. Yeah, and till the time we'll frame a policy, the electric vehicles will come. The world will move on to like say hydrogen fuels or the other form of fuels. What's your take on it?
So firstly,
Yeah.
sorry, yeah,
No. I mean, whether we are keeping
yeah,
pace with the
yeah.
developments. In
So
the
I don't know to what extent will hydrogen really pick up as a transport fuel. I think it's very interestingly in the year 1900. So this was before the Ford Model T came about. Uh, 30% of all cars that were being sold in the US were electric, right? So that quickly moved to like electric vehicles being wiped out within 2 decades, only because the Ford Model T came out. So you suddenly had extremely inexpensive vehicles, I mean, compared to what they previously were. And secondly, you had the petroleum industry developing, the refining industry developing, and refined products being available in markets far more easily, right? So the whole ecosystem developed, and suddenly within a couple of decades, for like internal combustion engines completely took over the market. I don't think hydrogen can take over the market that easily because there is no other supporting ecosystem. We are still at a very early stage when it comes to electric vehicles. Studies by the International Energy Agency show that approximately 3 million electric vehicles were sold last year, but it still constitutes like I'm forgetting, but 1 or 2% of the overall sales. It's still very low, but a few countries have made major strides in this issue. In China, for example, if I'm forgetting, is it Schengen or one of the cities? It now has 100% electric taxis. So all taxis are electric, all buses are electric. Last year in China alone, uh, is either 250,000 or 500,000 electric vehicles were sold in 1 year. In the very same year, only 7,000 electric vehicles were sold in India. So the divide is like very huge, and it's obviously a concern with electric vehicles that at the end of the day, your electricity is being produced using by burning coal. So are you really making any impact in the first place? But it's very important to note that it's very hard to change consumer preferences. It's easier to change something that is very centralized. With most of India's power comes from state owned electric generators and so on. It's easier for the government as a policy measure to switch, to move away from coal, than it would be for people to adopt electric vehicles or to just change their behavior. So I think these two things need to go hand in hand. At the moment, perhaps with 75% of electricity coming from coal, perhaps you'll probably have more emissions overall. But the issue is that since cars operate in urban areas, in areas where there's high concentration of people, even moving the source of pollution away from the city towards somewhere far away will be a big step in the right direction. Plus it's easier to ensure that there are regulations on these coal fired power plants than it is on each and every vehicle out there on the street. So in sum, it's you're moving in the right direction by focusing on electric vehicles. I agree there is no policy. A lot of these um, the domain of electric vehicles is divided by various ministries, which is a problem. So we should probably have like a unified. It should probably be given to one ministry as opposed to several. But these are issues that we're dealing with. But in general, yes, we should be pushing for electric and not worry about hydrogen at the moment.
You wanted to say something. Sorry, one sec. Yeah.
I wanted to talk a little bit about construction industry.
Yes.
It is recognized that a lot of pollution, I don't know in what terms of percentage, a lot of pollution is because of the construction industry. And I wanted to talk a little bit about are there regulations? Because as you see, the construction industry seems to be without any regulations. The property developers and the builders are having a field day. I mean, there is no pollution check at all in the places where there is new construction. So would you like to elaborate a little bit?
Yeah, you go ahead.
So there are few things here. So before we talk about construction, I want to talk a little bit about bricks. So bricks are used in the construction. So where are the bricks made and how are they made? So in most of the bricks that the brick kilns that exist around Delhi, and there are thousands of them. Firstly, they employ over I think 300 400,000 people. So they're providing employment. It's harder to shut them down en masse. Secondly, they're using designs which are which are very polluting. Just changing the design of the furnaces can change the amount of emissions that come out from these brick kilns. So that is something that even though the CPCB and other pollution control boards have mandated, we have not been able to successfully implement, because the construction industry itself is going through kind of a slump. So they don't have an incentive to invest more money to change construction design. So that is a major source of dust that is originating from the construction sector. Then the second aspect, which is what you're talking about, which is the construction activity itself, the buildings that are currently I'm not aware of any regulation which enforces the envelopes around the structures. And even if they do exist, once the construction is actually over, there's no way to handle the fugitive dust that remains at that site. So even if you remove the building envelopes which exist in some parts of the city, even if you remove them, after that the winds will just carry it away.
So,
This is something,
yeah.
yeah.
So sorry to interject, but actually, there is, we had a very good law in place. Okay. There was the environment impact assessment process, which the construction industry was supposed to follow. A year ago, the government removed this from the domain of the EIA process. So under the EIA process, they're supposed to give information like what will you do with the fugitive dust, how will you handle water pollution, how will you handle the construction dust. All this was mandated. But a year ago, a notification was introduced by the government exempting the construction industry. The logic given was housing for all. That was the logic given, and that we want to boost the construction industry, and therefore we are removing them from the EIA process. So I think this is a prime example of how there is a double speak on the part of the government. On the one hand, we say we want to control air pollution, but on the other hand, okay, we have one politician walking in, so that's a good thing. Welcome. Hi, I'm Bahar.
Hello, sir. Siddharth. Congratulations. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Hello, sir. Welcome to our. Thank you.
So I think this is a good point at which you've made an entry, because we were just talking about double speak within government sectors. We were talking about construction, the construction industry, and the discussion was about, well, in fact, I've just looked at the figures, and the IIT Kanpur study says that if you look at air pollution, PM10, 10% was construction dust. And this is IIT Kanpur study, which was done a while back. So if you look at the scale of construction happening right now in Delhi, it would be much more. And I think it would be interesting to address, I was telling about a notification which this government introduced a year ago, which removed the construction industry from the environment impact assessment process. So what do we do when the governments have these contradictory approaches? And I think that's a good point at which we ask you to give your keynote address.
Thank you very much, Bawal. I first of all should explain that I'm not late. It was actually planned that I would come at this time because I had other commitments and I couldn't.
Sir, I have to introduce you.
Oh, I'm
Oh,
sorry.
do you really want to? Yeah. All right, if you insist, please do.
Because nobody knows you.
That's right. I'll steal some of your water, Badly. Go ahead.
So we have our keynote speaker here. So thank you for accepting to speak on this important topic, and welcome to ORF. Of course, you are no stranger to ORF because you are associated with some of our flagship events. As I said, since most of you don't know Dr. Shashi Tharoor, let me introduce you formally. But I won't read his entire biodata because it's too long.
Certainly hope not. Yeah.
He is an honorable member of the parliament for the second time. He is the chairman of the Parliamentary Standing Committee on External Affairs. Earlier, during the UPA government, he served as the Minister of State for Human Resource Development and also for the Ministry of External Affairs. He also had a 3-decade distinguished career in the United Nations and served as the Undersecretary General. He is an award-winning author of 18 books of fiction and non-fiction. The most recent one was the paradoxical prime minister, which is still being debated and talked about. And he has won many literary awards, including a Commonwealth Writers' Prize. So welcome once again, and thank you for accepting to be the keynote speaker today.
Thank you, Mr.
Floor is
Vishwanathan.
yours.
And again, to begin where I left off, I really apologize for my late arrival. I just had a very full schedule, but I didn't want to turn down ORF's invitation to keynote this because I really think we have an outstanding book on a very important issue, and it deserves whatever time and support we can give it. I don't know if you've seen the book, many of you here, but I've said in my endorsement that in The Great Smog of India, Siddharth Singh convincingly raises the alarm on the silent killer that's destroying millions of lives in India, our toxic air quality, that is thoroughly researched and engagingly argued, and that it rings a chilling warning bell on one of our country's gravest and most complex development challenges, which also raises, of course, key questions about India's future. And that's why I think it's essential reading. So I did want to show my great interest in the book and my support for the author. I'm meeting for the first time, just to say this book deserves our attention, and that's why I'm here. I think the book is well worth reading, even if you aren't passionate about the subject, though I assume your presence here implies a level of interest that should make you want to read the book, because he doesn't get into complicated jargon. He's astonishingly readable. There is policy analysis, but there's much more. It's an engaging, moving, interesting narrative as well as an argument. I think if all books on all aspects of development were this good, we would really all be completely enlightened development experts around. Now, I know that you've already been discussing the book for an hour, so I won't go into too much detail about things that you're bound to have already covered. But I thought I would particularly draw your attention to what Siddharth suggests are 10 different ways to frame the issue, to think about air pollution. Have you discussed that, Bahar, in some detail already?
To some extent,
Yeah,
but it would be good to have your.
well, I mean, just to summarize some of the key things that I was struck by, the very fact that it's actually an assault on our freedom, that essentially it's going against Article 21 of the Constitution, which guarantees the right to life. How can you lead a life of dignity if you don't have a clean air to breathe? It's a very important point. The second principle, don't treat this with normality or normalcy. It should not be business as usual. There are grounds for panic. That we shouldn't worry about whatever gaps we have in our knowledge of the contributions to air pollution. We should deal with it. We should also be conscious, as political people, we are conscious certainly of the inequalities embedded in the air pollution strategy. If you're a poor village woman cooking in a chula inside a closed environment, you are suffering dangers that the sort of rich lady sitting in an air-conditioned room and being served by somebody from a kitchen obviously doesn't encounter. And the fact that some can insulate themselves more from others, some can buy air filters and others can't. All of these things are fundamental policy issues in terms of inequality. That we do need to find national solutions. We can't isolate Delhi's air problem and expect the government of Delhi to solve it. We have to involve the governments of neighboring states. We have to essentially think national. In fact, I think Gwalior has worse air quality than Delhi. Calcutta is not far behind. So we really do have to think about the entire country. We have to put the onus on the government. I've been trying to do that myself, and I'll tell you about that in a minute. But we do have to, I think, as he puts it very cleverly, ask not what you can do for the government, ask what the government can do for you. At the same time, understand the interests and motivations of the polluters. Why do these farmers burn the crop stubble, even though now the nation is very aware of the damage it causes? How can we accommodate some genuflection to their interests as we deal with saving our lungs? The meteorological misfortune exists, he says, and that's something that, we are victims of our geography, but that shouldn't stop us from acting. We have to do everything across the board, not just one area of action, but a whole lot of them. And at the same time, we have to do this in the context of development. We can be pro-economy and pro-growth while also being pro a clean environment. There's a 2 or 3 page summary of what the Chinese did, which is quite instructive because they aren't that different from us. And their problems till about 2010 were about as bad as ours are. I've actually been to Beijing and had the experience of looking out of my hotel window and being unable to see the next building, which actually was there, where that lady is sitting at the end of this table. But I couldn't see it because the haze was so bad. And that's, I'm talking 2006, maybe thereabouts. It was really, really grim. And how they've really cleaned up their act an extraordinary amount. Of course, top-down solutions work better in China than they do here. Tough decisions are implemented more effectively in China than they are here. Offending officials or dilatory officials are punished more severely than they are here. There are definite differences in systems, but that doesn't mean that we can't attempt to learn from some of their experiences. I mean, for God's sake, the British solution for London goes back to 1956 Clean Air Act, and that's 62 years ago. This should have been things we've learned from those bad guys who ruled us for 200 years. We could have learned how they cleaned up the pea super smogs of London. I remember a French diplomat friend of mine who was shocked at his exit medical to be asked by the doctor, how many packs of cigarettes do you smoke a day? And he said, I've been a non-smoker all my life. And the doctor said, your lungs tell a different story. And all he'd done was breathe our air for 3 years. That was it. And it looked like he was smoking 20 cigarettes a day. And in fact, that analogy turned out to be absolutely correct. I heard the story some years ago from the friend himself, but somebody very recently has published an article, one of our environmental journalists, maybe it was you, Bahar, I don't know, saying that breathing Delhi's air is the equivalent of smoking 20 cigarettes a day. So that's the scenario that we've gone and put ourselves into. Some of you may have known the New York Times correspondent Gardner Harris, who wrote a very powerful piece when he sort of asked for a premature transfer out of here, saying that he felt as a parent it was irresponsible of him to bring his child up in Delhi, that his child's asthma condition had got much worse because of the toxic air here. He had the option of leaving. The people in this room don't. And therefore, we have a particular stake in finding solutions to the inconvenient truth, the phrase that Siddharth uses. Now, Bahar asked about what we politicians can do, and I can tell you that I have been trying to do something on this. I took up this issue after the Diwali of 2016, which was when I think we all finally realized how bad things were getting because of self-inflicted wounds. I organized a roundtable in July of 2017, some months of preparation, to try and create, I called it a roundtable on framing a national action plan. But unfortunately, I have to admit, fell a victim of our politics, in the sense that all the non-political people I invited came. I had the Director General of AIMS, Dr. Guleria, who's an expert, as an immunologist. I got a number of NGOs to participate. I got Greenpeace. I myself actually have opened an Indian chapter of Air Quality Asia. Though it consists of me and John Koshi sitting here, that's about it in terms of being able to devote any time to it. But we are trying to raise consciousness through these efforts. And though we got a lot of these civil society stakeholders and healthcare experts and practitioners, we even had Dia Mirza come at our expense as a goodwill ambassador, very few parliamentarians showed up, and all the BJP ones dropped out at the last minute, having been told to. And what is more, so did one or two allied party members. So we lost some political traction on that. And though we had a good discussion, and we focused on what we could do as elected representatives, we couldn't get much beyond consciousness raising, because anybody with an authority to work on a national action plan wasn't there, and the Environment Ministry didn't show up at either political level or environmental level. This year I tried again, made many more personal efforts, got a few more politicians in. My second roundtable was in July of this year. Did it in partnership, I'm pleased to say, with ORF, which is no doubt one of the reasons why I'm here today, is because I thought that ORF as an institution would not suffer the political disability I suffered. I was wrong. The BJP MP still didn't come, and the minister who had promised to attend bailed out at the very last minute. So we are back to this challenge of how do we pursue what is clearly has to be a bipartisan effort, has to involve people of all parties. And I think we are exploring ways of taking this forward, but it's very clearly, though the 13 MPs who did attend my second roundtable came from a number of parties. They were all opposition MPs. And that we know isn't good enough in our system. You need the buy-in from the ruling party. In the meantime, the organization I had within the Congress party, the All India Professionals Congress, did a white paper. The Delhi chapter did a white paper on air pollution here, which was published. We got one day's media coverage in December of 2017, and then it sank without trace after that. But they did come up with some fairly interesting figures and some recommendations. Of course, had we known Siddharth was working on this book, we would have just waited and said, we'll put the All India Professionals Congress chap on this, because it's a very professional and far more far-reaching set of recommendations on how to go forward. I've often wondered why this hasn't become more electorally sensitive. In fact, a couple of years earlier than my involvement in air pollution, I addressed another ORF roundtable, again rather sparsely attended, on the question of why health isn't more of an electoral issue. Why is it that nobody goes and votes for or against a government because of what they're doing in the health domain? I don't know. We have to look at ourselves. It's the Indian public. We are a democracy. The Indian public votes. Health can be an issue, but has never been a political issue, never been a vote-winning issue, never been a vote-losing issue. Air pollution should be, because the failure of governments to show political urgency is costing lives, is killing children. The estimate is 5,000 to 6,000 children a year die in Delhi, directly or indirectly, because of air pollution. Now, if that's happening, why aren't at least 5,000 or 6,000 parents clamoring for governments to take action? I don't know. And all I can say is when the Diwali cracker ban was attempted, not this year, but the previous year, last year, there was far more outrage expressed against the judges for trying to ban firecrackers and all sorts of things about how Hindu rights were under threat, rather than actually realizing that we had a life-threatening risk that was affecting Hindus as well as everybody else equally, since you can't actually put a religious label on the smog we breathe. Now, the irony, of course, is the further discordance between the incredibly progressive positions our government has taken in places like the Paris Conference and so on every environmental target. There's a national clean air program. We signed up to the Copenhagen Agreement, the Paris Agreement, and Niti Aayog came up with a 15-point program about the same time as our roundtable. None of us have seen any of it being implemented. There is, in fact, really no significant implementation, no sense of time-bound deadlines, no sense of urgency about the crisis facing us all. And as I said, there's this petty politics being put above any serious attempt to have a cross-stakeholder, non-partisan discussion of the issue within the political space. And then we have even some direct sort of undermining of our air quality efforts with other policies coming up, like the Niti Aayog came up with a draft national energy policy, which I critiqued in an op-ed, because what it does essentially is reaffirm our dependence on coal. Now, the Chinese in 2010, by law, halved their use of coal in energy production, literally halved overnight. And we have instead said, no, we can't do without coal. It'll cost too much to convert coal-fired plants, etc. So we're going to carry on. Now, this is the same government that in parallel goes to Paris and makes the most absurd commitments to, 20,000 megawatts of solar energy and so on. We won't even get to 1% of the pledge. But we make these things in the air, do nothing to implement it, create no tax incentives for solar energy or anything else. And then meanwhile, we have the same government, same Niti Aayog coming up with a plan for more dependence on coal-fired power capacity, which is, by the way, not just continued dependence, but we're actually going to grow our coal-fired power capacity by 2040. We're estimating a demand to be going up to 1.14 billion tons, which will raise our present coal-fired power to 330 to 441 gigawatts by 2040. Which is obviously a direct contradiction of all our bromides about sustainability and security and so on. And everywhere in the world, solar and wind power tariffs are coming down. Major tax incentives are being given. Electric cars are hitting the roads. And in India, we carry on blissfully as if the government has no obligation to replicate any of these incentives, even to achieve its own declared targets. Now, clearly we have to engage with political parties. From my experience, as I said, I think we can get opposition parties because they see this as an issue to beat the government on the head with. We can't get the government or the government's political parties, whereas in fact we all breathe the same air and have the same stakes. And I think we should really get ORF to make a serious effort well in advance of next year's conference, saying, we know you've done this to us last year. Don't do this again. I know that at the level of your chairman, Sanjay Joshi, there is commitment to keeping involved with this issue, but we do need to get more buy-in. We also clearly need to engage people. I have been going around as one of the people of the Congress Party conducting consultations for our manifesto for the 2019 elections. And I've been leading actually the consultations on the environment. And I've had some sessions. I say some because very often finding stakeholders who are knowledgeable and can give informed suggestions on the environment is not always easy. But I had a very, very good one a couple of weeks ago in Bangalore, where we had about 40 people coming who were all renowned or at least very serious environmentalists who came up with a number of suggestions. Some have continued sending in suggestions, which we will put into the Congress Party manifesto. I wish I could put that in there too, but we'll certainly see if Siddharth can give us a few action points. You don't have to pledge to vote for the Congress, that would help, but certainly your ideas need to be aired by a serious political party as part of a political commitment in the manifesto. Air Quality Asia, which, as I said, I head in India, has adopted the model of parliamentary advocacy. That is, we want to generate a core group of dedicated and committed parliamentarians to champion the issue of air quality in Parliament. And of course, that means holding the government accountable for action or inaction on air quality. But not only that, it can also be to help the government if they actually come up with a credible air quality plan. We can help them implement it by giving them cross-party support in Parliament. But recently, for example, WHO had a conference on air pollution in Geneva, and nobody went from the government, nobody went from the ruling party. I was asked to go. I couldn't because I had other commitments, but I sent a young colleague of mine from the Congress Party, an MP from Amritsar, Gurjeet Singh Aujla, and he turned out to be the only senior Indian politician there. And he's, first-term MP, elected in a by-election after Amrinder Singh resigned his seat. So he's quite brand new at this. But he was able to come back from Geneva after building networks with air quality stakeholders in order to try and channel interventions in Amritsar. But, obviously, the lessons can be learned by all of us elsewhere as well. And one more thing is, of course, to widen air quality discussion to include the polluters. And I think Siddharth has addressed that in the book, and you may have already talked about it, so I won't repeat. But clearly that's very, very important, because if we include all concerns and interests, then we can perhaps really get a groundswell going for action. I just want to end with my own passionate faith in the need for development. I think given where the British left us, as I've written in my books, after 200 years, we do have a real imperative to pull our people out of poverty and to develop, but we don't have to do it. We do not have to develop our country in a haze of smoke and smog. I think we can turn our skies blue again, as I think the Chinese said in their reform cleanup plan. We can actually give our children decent air to breathe. We can host test matches in Delhi after November, which we have stopped being able to do because foreign countries won't play here in this foul air, or any other sport for that matter. Good luck in applying to host the Asian Games again or the Olympics, because no athlete wants to run in this kind of air. We are really in need of telling people how bad things are. And maybe, as MP for Thiruvananthapuram, I should invite every Delhi resident to take a compulsory holiday every December in my constituency, both to, of course, enhance your spending in my constituency, but also to realize that in India you can breathe clean air. I mean, literally every time I step off a plane in Delhi, having come from Thiruvananthapuram just 3.5 hours away, I am hit by shock. It's like, walking into an open oven or something. I mean, I don't mean the heat. I mean, there's a sudden dramatic change in air quality. You're breathing something different. And you feel it in my case, unfortunately, I tend to be rather allergic to smoke and fog, so I feel it all the more. But it's palpable. And living in other parts of India is a reassurance it doesn't have to be this way. There's a lot we can do. And I want to congratulate Siddharth once again for having written this book. I want to congratulate ORF for having held this discussion and for having joined me in promoting the issue. I'm holding you to your commitment to do this again next year. By the time July rolls around, we'll have a new government. I hope it will be. No, you haven't heard my sentence. I hope it will. I hope it will be a government that is more responsive to the urgency and the political importance of dealing with air quality. Didn't name any particular party or parties, but in that context, I really think that all of our stakeholders, people like Bahar and Siddharth who write about air quality and pollution, people like Ambassador Vishwanathan and ORF who have the institutional backing to get people to think about these issues, and politicians who obviously help write laws and influence government policy. We all need to be working on this together in order to come up with an effective solution. So that's it from me. Thank you, and Jai Hind.
Thank you, sir, for that very comprehensive and passionate explanation of the problem. And everybody here agrees that a problem like air pollution cannot be solved unless there is a non-partisan approach and a long-term approach, irrespective of which government comes to power. And that's what we have to see. Is there a commitment from all the parties and all the governments for this very important problem? Thank you once again, sir, for taking the time and coming and addressing us. And I'll talk to, of course, Sanjay Joshi. And you can be rest assured that ORF will continue the work on environment because it's one of the most important work that we are doing here.
Thank you.
So, with that, we will produce.
Thank you. I would like to take this opportunity on behalf of the Observer Research Foundation to thank Sashi sir, Ambassador Vishwanathan, the author Siddharth Singh, and Ms. Bahar Dutt, and all of you to come for this event and make it a fruitful discussion. I hope the discussion does not end over here. We take it outside and it turns into a bigger wave as a whole. We have a stall with Siddharth sir's book outside. I hope you go out and purchase it and you use it as the memo to talk to other people outside of this conversation.